Hurricanes, hailstorms, tornadoes, and wildfires. These are just some of the weather hazards that displace families and disrupt lives. Many of us are familiar with the scenes of devastation these hazards cause, and the recovery process for affected communities can take months, even years. In the most extreme circumstances, some may never be whole again. This may prompt many of you to ask, what's being done to reduce the risks associated with these hazards? To answer this question, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety presents the Disaster Discussions Podcast. Join me, your host, Armand Brody, as I sit down with professionals in the insurance, science, construction, and resiliency industries who will help us explore the intersection of these hazards with the built environment. We'll bring you in-depth conversations with experts from across the country and highlight how science is engineering real-world solutions for home and business owners to create safer, more resilient communities. Join us for these discussions every month. And to make sure you don't miss an episode, go subscribe to the Disaster Discussions Podcast on your favorite podcast app. We also invite you to engage with us on social media, to ask your questions, share your thoughts, and to learn more about the IBHS mission. From the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, we welcome you to the Disaster Discussions Podcast, where we explore the intersection of severe weather and the built environment. I'm your host, Armand Brody. Thank you again for joining us, folks. Let me catch you up on the last handful of episodes that we've been able to bring to you on Amazon, Apple, Google, and Spotify. Our most recent episode was a special segment called On the Radar. We spoke with Dr. Ian Jamanko and Sarah Dillingham, our lead research meteorologist and senior meteorologist, respectively. And we just talked, right, like we always do around here at IBHS in the break room and in the office. We talked about what all the craziness has been in the first half of 2023. And we've gotten an excellent response from you folks for that podcast episode. So if you've not watched that one or listened to it, make sure you do that. There's a plethora of ways you can get a hold of us. IBHS.org/disaster discussions podcast, as well as the previous ways I just mentioned. But please grab a hold of that one if you've not done so. For our May episode, we spoke with the Insurance Commissioner of the state of Alabama, Mark Fowler, as we celebrated 50,000 fortified designations and how important the state of Alabama has been and their commitment to resilience. So check that one out as well. So much good stuff going on in podcast land and in Disaster Discussions podcast land. So if you've not listened to our episodes, we've got quite a few of them for you to chew on as you're driving to and from work and doing chores around the house and all of those good things. So please make sure that you continue to support us. We believe in the work that we are doing, and you are helping our work spread across the world. So thank you all for your support of the Disaster Discussions podcast. Well, one of the pieces of the mission of IBHS is to prevent avoidable loss. And what I love about this podcast is we get to come at it from so many different angles. And today is a very special episode because we get the opportunity to look at disasters from an economic standpoint. And to help us do that, we bring in Dr. Kevin Simmons from the Department of Economics of Austin College in Texas, an accomplished author and scholar and educator. And Kevin comes to us to give us maybe a bit of a different viewpoint on all this talk about natural hazards and the work that we do. He's known us for so many years. We're going to talk about that as well. Kevin, I want to welcome you to the Disaster Discussions Podcast.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here, Armand.
It's a privilege to have you. And you've got an interesting journey. We'll get into that a little bit as well here as we get going. But it's a privilege to have you with us on the Disaster Discussions Podcast. So if you don't mind, let's jump right into it.
Okay.
So if you would, just sort of give us a summary of your journey, sir.
Well, academia is a second career for me. I worked for 17 years in the corporate world, most of that time working for the largest electric utility provider in the state of Texas, Texas Utilities. I was in research groups there at TXU. And along the early 1990s. We had a large nuclear plant that we had been building finally came online, and having to put that into rate base put some financial pressure on the firm. So they started doing some downsizings and stuff that firms do. And in the process of that, I began to realize that maybe this wasn't going to be the career I thought it was going to be. So I thought to look into what else I may want to do. Now, my mother was a professor. I was raised around colleges, and I was doing research at TXU. Already had my master's, so I thought maybe I'd like to go into academia. That means you need a PhD. So I went ahead and started taking some other classes, and then when the opportunity presented itself, I went ahead and left TXU, and we moved out to Lubbock, where I got my doctorate at Texas Tech University. Now, I was in economics, but while I was there, I met the folks at the Wind Engineering Institute, which is headed up by Kishore Mehta. And they were looking for an economist to work on a National Science Foundation project. And so I volunteered and began working with them. It ended up being my dissertation and got several publications out of it. I honestly thought that was the last time I was going to touch that stuff. I'd worked so long in the energy field, I thought if I have a research agenda, it'll be with my corporate background, it'll be in energy. But my first job was in Oklahoma City, and I arrived there in 1999, right after the May 3rd tornado went through the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. And there is a very large NOAA facility in Norman that is very active. It's now called the National Weather Center. But I found myself as the only economist in the state of Oklahoma that had ever done anything on natural hazards. I introduced myself to the folks at NOAA, and after that, I just started working in this field and have been so busy, I haven't even had the time to think about something else. So that's how I got into doing natural hazards work. And it's been, frankly, a wonderful research agenda. The people that are involved in this research from all areas, meteorologists, wind engineers, insurance folks, I've become friends with all of them, and consider myself very fortunate to be able to be a part of that community.
You are very familiar with IBHS, and your time knowing IBHS goes back quite a ways. Share that with our audience, if you would, please.
It does. I was at the Hazards Conference that the University of Colorado does every year. I think this was in 98. Pretty sure it was in the summer of 98. And I was making a presentation of my dissertation topic that I'd been working on. And there were people from IBHS there. There were also people from the research arena at State Farm that were there. And after my presentation, they came up and introduced themselves to me. I was invited to go out and meet the folks in Bloomington, Illinois, where State Farm had their research facilities. I was also invited to do some presentations at y'all's annual meeting very soon after that. In fact, I made presentations at y'all's annual meetings for several years in a row at first. So it's been 25 years that I've known the folks at IBHS, and I've worked with you guys. You've even funded some of the work that we did. So we've done some projects with you, particularly when Tim Reinhold was there. So yeah, I've known you guys a long time.
It's good to have friends, and enduring friends at that. And we're certainly appreciative of the relationship that we've been able to share over the past 2+ decades. Kevin, let's dive in here.
Okay.
You know this very well. Since 1980, we've had well over $1 trillion in damage from windstorms and hail in the United States. And around 85% of that has occurred within the last 25 to 30 years. From your vantage point and with your expertise and given your knowledge, how do we explain that?
Well, most of that damage that has been, particularly the recent damage, has been along the coast. And we have seen a large migration of people who want to live on the coast And you can't blame them for that. I mean, it's wonderful, and it can be paradise, but there's a lot of risk there, and some of the structures that have been built were just not able to withstand the hurricane winds that would come along, and so you would have just some devastating storms. Now we had some series of really devastating storms that came through, particularly that hit Florida. The state of Florida in 2004, 2005 had 7 major landfalling hurricanes hit. Of course, in 2005 we had a Hurricane Katrina that affected New Orleans so badly that we all know about. And then the Texas coast got hit by so many in more recent years. And then we had Hurricane Maria. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And when you put vulnerable structures in the path or in an area that's risk to the path of a violent storm, you're going to have bad things happen. And so that is the main driver of that. And of course, as you guys well know, the solution, you either tell people you can't live there, or you tell people that if you're going to live there, we need to build better structures that are going to survive windstorms as they come along. So that's the main driver of it. Of course, there's been other things happening. My friend at Northern Illinois University had a paper that he and his co-author at Villanova had a paper out called The Expanding Bullseye. And he's talking about tornadoes now. And what he meant by that was that in these urban areas like Oklahoma City, like Dallas-Fort Worth, which are vulnerable to tornadoes, the metropolitan areas are just growing and growing and growing. And the bullseye for the tornadoes, the targets that the tornado can hit, have just gotten larger and larger and larger. Where I live in just north of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you've got about 100 miles from north to south that is urban or suburban area. So a tornado that comes through North Texas, how is it going to miss? It's got so many potential areas to hit. And fortunately, we haven't had an EF5 that would go through downtown Dallas or right down I-30, but we've had some pretty big ones go close to there. And so it is, we're just putting a lot of infrastructure in risky areas, and that's going to create big losses.
Yeah, I remember, I'm thinking back to what Ian said during our last episode of this podcast, and he said, and I'd love for you to follow up on this, Kevin. He said, we've got too much stuff in the way.
Yeah.
And it's hard to miss if there's so many houses, so much stuff, to use Ian's word. It's hard to miss if there's so much stuff in the way, in the path.
Yeah, exactly. Ian's exactly right. And it even compounds itself with the way we are designing developments. For instance, where I live here in North Texas, if you look at subdivisions that were built in the 60s and the 70s, are sitting on fairly large lots. And so the space between the houses is pretty good space, between the houses. Now, if you look at a subdivision that's being built right now, they've just got these houses crammed right on top of each other. So even if you have a small tornado that comes through and it hits the first house on the street, that is debris that's going to now be missiles heading toward the next house, which may only be 10 feet away. And so Ian's right, we put too much stuff in the way, but the way we're designing these developments exacerbates that problem because we're just cramming these houses right on top of each other. And unless those houses were built to withstand windstorms like that, then you're going to have the damage that you guys are alluding to.
Let me ask you about this. The issue of building codes. It's something we talk about all the time here at IBHS. But from your viewpoint, why are statewide building codes so important, Kevin?
Well, they're important because they should be designed to face the risk that is common for that state. Now, the only state that has passed a statewide building code intended to address the wind threat is the state of Florida. There's some history there. They had Hurricane Andrew that came through, did absolutely devastating effects in the state of Florida. Several insurance companies went bankrupt with what they were doing in Florida. Several other insurance companies have limited what they're willing to insure in the state. So you've got a crisis of being able to provide insurance at a reasonable cost. And if people can't live somewhere with reasonable costs, they're not going to move there. So the state of Florida was forced to do something that no other state has done, and that is to put in place a statewide building code that is built to wind engineering standards. It went into effect in, 2002, and didn't have to wait very long because remember I mentioned that the hurricane season of 04 and 05, 7 landfalling hurricanes coming across, and so we got an opportunity to see what benefit, if any, this new building code would be. And you know what we found was that homes built to the new standards, the new building codes, compared to homes built prior to the building codes, suffered 53% less damage than older homes. In addition to that, when you consider the fact that there were fewer claims made on homes built to the new building codes, the overall reduction in damage between homes built to the Florida code compared to homes that were not built to the new Florida code is 72%. A 72% overall reduction in damage based upon the statewide building code. Now, the economics of that, if you look at the cost to build a home to the new code versus the reduction in losses across the expected lifetime of that home, you're talking about retrieving $6 in avoided damage for every $1 you spend on beefing up the structure. So it's an incredibly good payoff. So building codes are very, very important. Now, not every state faces the risk that Florida does, but I had a paper I did with y'all have a sister organization in Toronto called the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Paul Kovacs is the head of that group, and Paul and I did a study that we were trying to examine what other states would be good candidates for a statewide building code, and we came across 3. They're not going to be surprises to anybody. The states of Oklahoma, Alabama, and Mississippi all had very good benefit to cost ratios if they were to adopt a similar building code as the state of Oklahoma. Now, of course, as you know, the state of Oklahoma does not have a statewide building code, but they do have one city, the city of Moore, that has adopted a municipal building code that was similar to what they had in Florida. And they've had great results from that. The only surprise is that other cities in the state of Oklahoma did not follow suit, or that the state didn't follow suit as Florida did.
We're going to come back to more as time allows shortly. But I want to sort of come back just a little bit, Kevin, and I want to look a little bit more broadly at your perspective in general. You mentioned Hurricane Andrew. When a storm like that threatens, as an economist, as a professor, what things do you start to think about right away? So give our audience a sense of how your mind starts to work when a Katrina or an Ian or an Andrew is on the way.
Right. Well, first of all, I think you have to be concerned about any potential loss of life. That's got to be top of mind anytime these storms start approaching. And I think that FEMA has and the local authorities in the most recent batch of storms do a remarkable job in trying to evacuate people and stuff like that. Obviously, in tornadoes, you don't have the opportunity to do that because you don't have time to evacuate and things like that. But once you get past that concern about loss of life, then you start wondering what is in the path of this event. As Ian said, what is the stuff that is in the path of this storm that is headed toward Florida or headed toward Dallas or whatever? And you hope, and I live where we have tornadoes, so you hope that the tornado is going to go in an area that is, sparsely populated, not a lot of stuff to hit targets. But boy, we had a tornado, I think it was in 2018, went through North Dallas, where I grew up. And North Dallas is a densely populated area. So anytime you have a storm going through a densely populated area, the chances of high loss and the possibility of people getting hurt or killed just goes up exponentially. So your first concern is this going to hit? Is this going to be a lethal storm? Secondly, is it going to hit populated areas? Because if it does, you can just about guarantee that we're going to have billion-dollar losses, which aren't even unusual anymore. That was the thing about the May 3rd tornado. I think it was the first billion-dollar event. Now it's hard not to have an event that reaches those numbers. So we're almost inured to the high dollar numbers.
Good points, all of those. Let's talk about this because I'm always curious about this aspect of your work and our work here at IBHS. How do we communicate the importance of mitigation, given the fact that, let's look at it from your perspective, because right, your background, your knowledge is the economics of it all. Let me back up though before I even go that far. When you have these conversations with the various groups of people that you speak to on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, it's my observation that as soon as the numbers come out, we start hearing and seeing millions and billions. There's almost this discomfort. From your vantage point, how do we make those conversations? How do we make sure those conversations are being had in a way that's going to lead to some understanding and maybe even more of an acceptance of what the science and the data of what those things are telling us?
Yeah, that's not an economic question so much as it is a social science question about how people receive and process negative information. We see an event happen. It gets our attention, but our attention, unless it personally affected us, hit my house, hit my parents' house, something like that, the heightened attention doesn't last very long. And we go back to a state where, since the probability of that tornado hitting my particular house is so small, I tend to just ignore it. I set the probability of it happening to me at 0. Now, it's a little harder to do that on the coast because when a hurricane comes through, it takes a wide swath. And so you do see people that live in the coastal areas give different probability assessments to being directly affected by a hurricane than people living in North Texas or Oklahoma do to a tornado. But we just tend to block it out and just say, that's not going to happen to me. That's not going to happen to me. And so when you tell yourself that enough, it takes a really tragic event to boost you out of that inertia to realize that, maybe we need to do something, here, whether as a community, or as an individual. So I think that would be my take on it, is people just don't like to think about, scary things, bad things, even when it just happened. Yeah, we're paying attention to it, but as soon as the cameras leave, as soon as things start, settling down, we go back to that state where we underestimate the likelihood that I or someone I know or care about is going to be affected by these things.
Yeah, you're right. You're right about that. Um, Economically speaking, and I know you've done extensive research on this, how do you know? What do you look for to tell you that a community or a state is moving in the right direction relative to resilience? What does that look like?
Well, it's either one of two things. You've either got a community that has made a decision, as the state of Florida did, and as the city of Moore did, that have taken public policy measures, building codes, to enhance their resilience. There's also things communities can do that don't necessarily fall within building codes. And the Insurance Services Office has their BSAGS ratings. And we did a study looking at the differences in the average ratings. And that's the building grade enforcement. Oh, God, now I'm going to standards. God, I've gone brain dead. The white hair will tell you that getting old sucks. But you're familiar with the BSAGS ratings are, and I think your audience are too. It's the rating given to a community on their overall resilience. And the higher the rating, or the better, actually the lower the numbers are in BSAGS, they are considered a more resilient community, and therefore they may qualify for different underwriting criteria. What we did find, and this is a little, we did a study on that in Florida, and what we did find was that communities with the better BSAGS ratings tended to be urban, they tended to be wealthier, they tended to have a younger, more well-educated population. So you've got all of those ingredients there of people who are not only aware, but are willing maybe to dig a little bit deeper. They have the resources with their affluence to be able to do some things. But then, of course, the sad part of that is the corollary is that, less affluent, poorer communities are almost by default the most vulnerable. And then they would tend to have lower. So there's an awful lot of social science stuff that goes into your question that is well beyond just the economics of it. Economics certainly plays a part, but that's the kinds of things that we've looked at that would suggest that. And what other things do I look for? Of course, what you guys have going in Alabama with your Fortify program, that's a really interesting one. Because I'm not as familiar, so you're going to have to correct me if I misspeak on this, Armand. But there would have to have been a receptive group of builders and stakeholders that really want to push, that type of resilience on a voluntary basis, as opposed to doing it public policy wise. And I think that you guys have had some really good success there. I wish we could replicate that in other areas. I haven't studied it, but that may be a good case study. Why was it so accepted in Alabama? Why have they had the success? That may give you some clues to the kinds of things that we're looking for.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the conversation I had with Commissioner Fowler and just his remarks about how chaotic the insurance market was, and the commissioner then, the insurance commissioner at the time, Jim Ridling, was just so much of a believer in something has to be done. There has to be some science, there has to be some research, there has to be some information to bring some calm to the chaos. And that was really a big part of how the fortified program developed such a stronghold in the state of Alabama. But you're right, it does take people to just believe that there's something that has to be done, and be willing to put themselves out there to say, we've got to be better for our citizens. We've got to be better for resilience's sake.
Yeah, yeah. Or it could take, like what happened in the state of Florida. The Hurricane Andrew was such a big event.
Right.
You couldn't ignore it. You couldn't ignore it. And you couldn't just let time heal that. It was, at the time, the largest storm. It's been eclipsed since then, but at the time, it was the largest storm that we had had. And it couldn't be ignored. Same thing happened in Moore. I know you wanted to talk about Moore a little bit later, so I'll hold off on that. But they had a similar
Let's go now.
trigger.
We can go now.
Okay, they had a similar trigger in Moore. The tornado that went through Moore, it was an EF5 tornado, terrible tornado going through a densely populated suburb of Oklahoma City. And unfortunately, it hit two schools a mile apart from each other while the kids were there. Hit Briarwood Elementary and it hit Plaza Towers Elementary. At one of those schools, 7 kids perished. And that type of tragedy, with the raw emotions that go with it, I believe was the catalyst that told the city leaders in the city of Moore, we got to do something. We got to do something. And of course, their response was to enact the first municipal building code that was for wind resilience. And they did so with the cooperation of the local home builders. And as far as our research shows, they have paid no negative price for that. And when I say no negative price, the concern that city leaders in other communities have anytime you're being pressured to have a stricter code is they will say, well, if we do that and our neighboring cities don't do it, the cost of our houses are going to be higher and their houses are going to be lower, and the builders and the customers are all going to move to that other city. Well, what we found in Moore was that did not happen. We did a study after the enactment of their code. We waited about a year, 2 years to have some houses be sold. And we based it on 3 metrics. We based it on price, we based it on sales and building permits, and we compared it to their neighbor, Norman, just to the south, which did not have an enhanced code. And what we found was that there was no statistical difference in the changes in price over that period between Norman and Moore, the changes in sales between Norman and Moore, and the changes in building permits between Norman and Moore. So the fear that city leaders have is not borne out by the research. In fact, it may be argued that Oklahoma City is such a known area for high propensity of tornadoes that it may be a benefit. That, yeah, I want a house built to these standards because if I'm going to move to central Oklahoma, I want to have something that's as safe as possible.
Let's keep driving down this street a bit.
Okay.
I'd love for you, Kevin, to sort of speak more broadly, given the many studies and all the research you've done. What is the value of mitigation for home buyers? I'll put myself in the shoes of John or Mary getting ready to buy a home, and maybe in one of these states that is prone to a hurricane or a tornado. What is the data showing us about the value of mitigation for little John or little Mary?
Well, of course, that question can be answered 2 ways. It can be answered on a macro or community level basis, but it can also be answered on a micro or individual level basis. Let's start with the individual. Our studies have shown that mitigation adds value to a home in much the same way as renovating a bathroom would do. And that can be, we've examined it from hurricane mitigation features on Galveston Island, the hurricane the shutters, hurricane shutters that people have on their windows and doors. What we found in Galveston was that if you had hurricane shutters on your house, the value of your house went up about 5%. There was a study that was done in Alabama on fortified. I didn't do this study. It was done at the University of Alabama. But this study looked at the value of a fortified home versus a non-fortified home, and the increase in sales price was 7%. That if you had a fortified home in Alabama, you could expect a 7% increase in the value of the homes. A group from Florida State did a study in South Florida after Hurricane Andrew, because there's 3 counties in South Florida that already had a building code that was beyond the state building code, and they enhanced it even more after Hurricane Andrew. And these guys did a study that homes that were built after the new building codes are put into place. Now, this is before Florida did the statewide code. These 3 counties got it done real fast. They found the same thing, that if you bought a house with the better building codes, the value of your house went up. We did a study in Oklahoma looking at storm shelter, tornado shelters. And what we found was, and the motivation for this, FEMA had a program after the May 3rd, 99 tornado to provide grants to people to put in storm shelters in Oklahoma. So we used that to see a few years later, look at resale data, and we found that storm shelters increase the value of your home by about 3%. Now, that's all just raw economics. There's also the peace of mind, and that has an economic benefit to it, that if I have a shelter in my house, or if I have a structure that's built with resilient features, my stress and concern and anxiety about an impending storm is going to be lessened, and there is some peace of mind that comes from that. Now, how do you value peace of mind? Well, that's hard, but you can't say it's zero. It's like asking somebody, a tornado is coming for your community. What would you be willing to pay to be able to have a tornado shelter to use in that moment? That gives you some sense of the economic value. I wouldn't try to put a number on that for analysis, but it's not zero. So there are all kinds of things from the individual. Now, from the community, look at the BSAGS ratings again. If your community is more resilient, your ratings on that program are going to improve. If your ratings on that improve, the underwriting criteria for your community is going to change and get better, which over time will affect the rates that the people that live in your town pay on insurance. So it makes a less expensive place to live over time once that's absorbed into the underwriting system. And I'll say one other thing, and this has been very recent. Just a couple of weeks ago, there were insurance companies that began making movements that they are going to begin limiting their exposure in California. Now, you've got Florida, which since Hurricane Andrew, you've had fewer insurance companies wanting to underwrite properties, particularly on the coast in the state of Florida. Now we're starting to see that in other areas. As areas become less resilient, and as we as a society have to deal with how climate change is affecting this, how population movement to vulnerable areas is affecting this, it's going to get more and more and more expensive, which means the insurance industry is either going to have to drastically raise their rates, making it exorbitantly expensive to live in some places, or say, as they're beginning to do, this is getting to be a risk we can't insure. And so I think there's benefits from the personal, the micro, but then there's more macro benefits that if we don't get this right, we may be creating communities that people can either no longer afford to live in because it's just too expensive, or you can't get insurance to build a home in that area, or places are just going to be to the point that we can't recover. So that's the way I would think about it, Armand.
I just want to I want to reiterate what you just said, and I'd love for you to just kind of give it to me again,
Okay.
because I want our audience to really understand this, because you just gave us quite a bit there a moment ago. That not just from a peace of mind standpoint, but we have data, we have evidence that shows us that a commitment to resilience is economically beneficial for everyone involved. Am I
Right.
right on that?
Yes.
Put some
Yes.
meat on that bone. I want to make sure that that point comes through loud and clear, Kevin.
Well, you need look no further than the state of Florida. Again, they had the perfect natural experiment. 2004, 2005, 7 landfall hurricanes struck the state of Florida. Look at the difference in the damage profile for homes that were built to the Florida Building Code versus the ones that were not. And I know I gave you these statistics earlier, but they're worth repeating. If you include the reduction in claims filed and you include the difference in the damage profiles between homes built to the Florida Building Code versus those that were not, overall, in those 2 years, we saw a reduction of 72% of the cost or of the damage from those hurricanes. So a community that has made a commitment to build in a resilient fashion is going to be able to recover faster. And we didn't include these items in here. They're going to be able to recover faster, which means their economy is not going to take the hit that economies will take. You know, after Hurricane Katrina, there were, the estimates that I saw, about 250,000 people left New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. That was an economic migration, the largest that we've seen in many, many, many decades. There's an economic cost to that. It took the city years to recover from Hurricane Katrina. I just got back from Puerto Rico, where I was in contact with people who live in Puerto Rico, and hearing the stories. I don't have any data on this, so I have nothing but anecdotes. But to hear the stories that they would tell me, that after Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, the devastation it put on that island, that they were without power for many months. So many of the businesses were hit. People were out of work. Many people left Puerto Rico. There was another migration out of Puerto Rico trying to recover or trying to find something better than what the living conditions were there. So there's just a whole list of things, from the personal all the way up to macroeconomic kinds of considerations, that if the climate scientists' predictions are true, and I'm not a climate scientist, but I know these guys and I trust these guys, if their assessments are true, we can only look to the future that the risks are going to go up. And if those risks go up and we're prepared, maybe we can, get through those times a little bit easier. If we're not prepared, it's going to be tragic. It's just going to be tragic to see.
You make such a good point, and on so many different levels, because when we hear about hurricanes, when we hear about storms, tornadoes, our minds, and they should, our minds go straight to how many lives were lost, right? Mm-hmm. You watch a telecast, you watch a broadcast, and the broadcast may even start with the number of lives that were lost because of a severe convective storm, because of a hurricane, whatever the case may be. But as you mentioned, there are so many more things at play. Economically speaking, communities, as you talked about with New Orleans, it can take so many years to get back to even a semblance of a sense of normalcy there, from a community and from an economic standpoint. And you laid that out so beautifully. And I think it's so important that we all understand that, especially for those of us who are listening to this podcast on a regular basis. To sum it all up, Kevin, it pays to be resilient. It pays to commit. it
Yeah.
pays to commit to resilience.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, you pay me now or you pay me later. And um, the, uh, the, the story is there. We know how to protect properties from most hazards. I mean, you know, we can't protect every property from every hazard, but the wind engineers have done a pretty good job, a really good job, of designing ways to make a house resilient from most of the things that most of the storms that would hit it. My job was to show that that effort is cost effective, and it is. We've got a story. Getting people to address that and to embrace that story, I think that's the next challenge. How do we communicate this in such a way that it gets into the zeitgeist? It breaks through so that people can get that. And, you know, it's not really that much different than in the 1960s. I told you my mom was a college professor. Kinesiology and health, those were all her fields. So as her kids growing up, we were inundated with the messages from the American Cancer Society about the dangers of smoking. Mm-hmm. People ignored it until they didn't. And eventually that message broke through and we had a societal change that is very different than societal attitudes about those things in the 50s and the 60s. So I think the same thing can happen. I think that you could have people embrace this message. The tragedy is, more than likely, really bad things are going to happen, regrettably, before it reaches the point that people will break through. When I was teaching my classes, my mitigation example that the kids love is to talk about the story of the Three Little Pigs. And, you know, we're going to keep building our houses out of straw until we realize that the wolf is right there ready to tear us apart. And then it occurs to us that maybe the brother that did the house out of bricks wasn't such a dumb brother after all.
Economics and a literature lesson from Kevin Simmons. Kevin, we're just about out of time.
Okay.
I have so many more things I want to talk to you about, but what other thoughts do you have? I just want to hear you talk and offer some insights here on this conversation.
I don't really know if I have any insights per se. It's just, I've watched this. Like I said, I've been involved in this research agenda for 25 years. There's been a lot of really bad storms in 25 years. And each one of them is a tragedy. And not all of the damage could be prevented. Not all of the deaths could have been prevented. But significant amounts of it could have been. Significant amounts of the damage could have been prevented. Significant amounts of the injuries and fatalities could have been prevented. And it just breaks your heart. I mean, it just, you know, I'll just give you an anecdote. We were at my son's house. He lives in Oklahoma City. And we were there after the El Reno tornado. We were in Oklahoma City with Drew when the El Reno tornado went through. That was a horrible tornado. It was a mile wide, EF5. Fortunately, it was out in the country, but it did cross Interstate 40. And, you know, there were fatalities, there was damage. But my wife, after this tornado, my wife just almost got in our son's face and told him, "You're getting a storm shelter," and really impressed that on him. Now, The downside was everybody in Oklahoma City had the same idea. The waiting list for a storm shelter in Oklahoma City after El Reno was 18 months. But it made an impact, and it was something that got very personal for our family. So it's just, like I say, it's just heartbreaking to see the damage, to see the fatalities. We can do better. We can do better. We could have public policy that's better. We could have public policy, and public policy doesn't have to be building codes. You could go the market route and say, let's give you tax incentives. Let's give you, and Oklahoma has tried several of these, and let's do something so that people are nudged into doing the right thing as opposed to being pushed into doing the right thing. Now, building codes is probably the most effective, because once they're in place, every house from that point on, is going to be built to these, or you hope, is built to these standards. But I think that's just, this is a tragedy that is largely preventable, and we can do better. A disaster is when you have a natural event that affects people that were not properly prepared, or people at the wrong place. To call it a natural disaster takes away the idea that we as humans did have a role in determining whether or not this event was going to be, or the size of the damage, the size of the fatalities. We have a say-so in that, but we need to say it before the disaster, before the event occurs.
Exactly right. And everything you just said, Kevin, sums up why we come to work every day. Mm-hmm. It's a part of our IBHS mission: preventing avoidable loss, preventing avoidable suffering. You use the word a few times there: prevent. We talk all the time here at IBHS about the fact that we are not powerless. And so everything you just said, your summary just a moment ago, really encapsulates our mission statement. And it's such a pleasure to have someone with your perspective to provide that economic viewpoint. And really that viewpoint is harmonious with the research and the science that we do here at the Research Center, inside the test chamber, and even the work that is done out in the field. So I can tell you with 100% confidence and gratitude that it has been a complete joy, Kevin Simmons, to have you on the Disaster Discussions podcast here today.
Well, thank you. And I've enjoyed talking to you guys too, Armand. Like I said, you guys are longtime friends. So it is quite an honor to be able to visit with you today.
And I hope, Kevin, that time will allow you to join us again in the relatively near future.
That sounds good to me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions podcast, an IBHS production. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app, or watch the podcast on our website at ibhs.org/disaster discussions podcast and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety YouTube channel. Connect with us on our social media pages on Twitter at Disaster Safety, Facebook at facebook.com/disaster safety, and on Instagram at IBHS_org. For more great content from IBHS, including ongoing research efforts happening at our facility, episodes of our podcast, and more, visit ibhs.org.